is it that grabs an audience at the first level?
Forbidden. Something that's forbidden. So that you're saying to somebody, come with me and I will say things to you that nobody else will say. And I will show you things that nobody else
That
dares
are so horrible to imagine.
to you. That's right. And again, it shares the same attraction as comedy.
Horror and comedy are two of the most similar genres in fiction. To some of you, I bet that sentence makes absolutely no sense, but hopefully the Jordan Peele fans out there already know what I'm talking about. I highly recommend watching this video if you want to learn more about the connection, but I'm going to talk specifically about an aspect of why it's so strong. Stephen King said that both genres follow the mantra, "I'm going to show you something you haven't seen before." In my mind, this can be interpreted in two ways. The first is on an external level. This is where comedy and horror media subvert the expectations of their audience on a societal scale, using forbidden subject matter that often isn't present or even explored in real life. In Pet Sematary, mild spoiler alert for a book that's been out over 40 years, Stephen King uses the example of the death and subsequent resurrection of a child, subverting a tragedy that happens every day in real life within the story with a supernatural twist. The second interpretation is on an internal level. This is where comedy and horror subvert the expectations that they themselves have established. An example of where I saw this recently is It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Watching a group of people desperately trying to escape a wedding full of drugged up zombies isn't very funny, but watching the gang of silly characters we've grown to know in that same situation subverts our expectations of the show and makes us laugh. Now, to fully showcase what I mean here, I'd like to use a few more in-depth examples and compare them. First, in terms of those external subversions, I'm going to talk about a few horror projects: Perfect Vermin and Stephen King's Insomnia. And yes, I am a Stephen King fan. And then I'll rattle through some comedy, including What We Do in the Shadows, Four Lions, and Monty Python. If none of that sounds interesting to you, then don't worry, it won't take long. I'm much more interested in internal subversions. For that, I'm going to talk about one of my favourite comedy shows of all time, Community, and then a couple of other horror games, including Silent Hill 4 and Amnesia the Bunker. They may seem like polar opposites, a light-hearted sitcom and some terrifying horror games, but they have more in common than you might think. What is the external expectation about smoking? There's no singular answer to this. To some people it might be smoking is unhealthy but fine in small doses. To others it might be smoking is a terrible stain in our society. But the specific expectation that Perfect Vermin addresses is smoking is detrimental to our body. To a lot of you, this might be the extent of your everyday thoughts on smoking. It certainly was for me. And you might be wondering how or why a game would ever want to subvert this notion. But the statement that Perfect Vermin leaves you with is: smoking has violent, destructive, agonizing effects on your body and mind. Skip to the time on screen if you want to avoid spoilers and play the game yourself. Trigger warning for health anxiety and the big C. The object of the game is to find and destroy 5 objects around an office which are secretly made up of flesh. Of course, you might end up destroying plenty of perfectly normal objects in search for these anomalies, but don't worry, that doesn't lose you any points. You can destroy as much as you please. A news anchor intermittently appears and prompts you to do better. Each time he shows up, his appearance degrades slightly and the pile of cigarettes on his desk grows bigger. Every level changes and becomes more chaotic, until the news anchor looks like a horrific mutated creature. He says, before you wake up in a doctor's office, you are the news anchor, and the doctor informs you that your cancer has spread. The game ends with a harrowing line, from my interpretation, you play as the physical manifestation of chemotherapy, trying desperately to root out cancer cells, but destroying much of the body in the process. The decline of the news anchor shows how the body is destroyed with his appearance, and how the mind is destroyed with his dialogue. You try to save him, but to no avail. The game is rough and leaves you with quite a pit in your stomach. The external expectations surrounding smoking are explored in such an original, subversive, and haunting way in Perfect Vermin, and it changes your expectation of what anti-smoking dialogue can even be. Although I mentioned a specific expectation earlier, it's more about subverting all of your expectations about smoking, in the sense that no one has imagined smoking in this way before as such a personified, destructive process. To hammer home this point of external subversions in horror, I'm going to name a few Stephen King books briefly. Don't worry, I won't take long and I won't spoil any of them. Insomnia, subvert your expectations of abortion, extremism, and dreams. Carrie, subvert your expectations of high school bullying and ostracization and their consequences. Cujo subverts your expectations of dogs. Salem's Lot subverts your expectations of vampires. The Institute subverts your expectations of telepathy. In essence, King likes to take things we're all aware of and present them in a subversive, new way that no one's ever thought of before. Those who have read the books, I hope you understand what I mean for each of these, and those who haven't, I hope you grasp the concept anyway, and I highly recommend reading some of the King of Horror yourself. This one's my favourite. Now, the external subversions of comedy. I don't feel compelled to analyse this for too long because most of it seems pretty obvious to me. I'm sure lots of people could come up with some more complex examples, but here are the ones that I thought of. What we do in the shadows subverts our expectations of vampires. We expect them to be scary and or serious, so an entire comedy series about them is a very funny premise on its own. A lot of the jokes come from the very idea of vampires doing something that we wouldn't expect of them.
We drank the blood of some people, but the people were on drugs. And now I'm a wizard.
Hence the idea of subverting external expectations. In a similar vein, Four Lions is a comedy film about terrorists, something we historically would never associate with humour. Therefore, lots of the jokes come from the idea terrorists doing something we wouldn't expect of them. And finally, Monty Python did this decades and decades ago. A lot of the jokes in Monty Python and the Holy Grail come from the idea of King Arthur doing something we wouldn't expect of them, or medieval knights in general. Similarly, Life of Brian explores characters from the Bible doing things we wouldn't expect of them, most notably with them accidentally worshipping a random man named Brian instead of Jesus.
I am not the Messiah, do you understand?
Only the true Messiah denies his divinity.
All right, I am the Messiah.
Obviously these subversions aren't always something that you've never seen before, just that aren't very common. If I'm being honest, I found that there's not that much to analyse when it comes to external subversions. The link directly from these external subversions to the scares or the jokes aren't as clear as with the internal subversions. I myself can't generalise what makes things funny or what makes things scary, but I can say that in my opinion, horror and comedy are all about the unexpected. External subversions is that concept on the very base level. Now, we need to talk about the next level up. I'll tell you about the third level later. Community is a masterpiece. It's a show which laughs in the face of sitcom tropes, which blends action and horror and fantasy and romance and emotion somehow into one show that is almost arbitrarily labelled a comedy. Don't get me wrong, it is funny. A lot of the time, it's brilliantly funny.
Look, I hate cops. You have to.
But my favourite jokes come from the internal expectation subversions. Now, I often try and show people Community. Why wouldn't I? I love it and I want to share it with my friends. The problem is, the best episodes of the show can't exist in isolation. I don't mean that in the sense that the story is difficult to follow. I mean a lot of the comedy doesn't work. The jokes don't land because the internal expectations that the audience have of the characters in the show are established over a lot of episodes. Let's look at season 1 as an example. The show begins almost as a standard sitcom. A group of 7 wacky individuals who are brought together by a community college and some mild hijinks ensue. It's good, sure, but it's not Community yet. Fast forward to the 23rd episode of season 1 and we have an episode parodying 28 Days Later, Die Hard, Scarface, Predator, Terminator and The Matrix in an all-out paintball battle royale brawl. Now, even if you don't recognise any of these references within the episode, almost everyone recognises the action tropes being parodied, and it completely subverts our expectations of the show. Watching Dutch Schaefer say this to Al Dillon,
"You son of a bitch,"
isn't necessarily funny, but watching Troy Barnes say the same thing to Jeff Winger,
Jeff Winger, you son of a bitch.
when our expectations of the show is a light-hearted sitcom, is hilarious in itself. What's more, seeing our expectations of the characters being subverted is great. Abed, best character in the show, is always quippy and funny with his film references, but seeing other characters suddenly lean into his wackiness is so entertaining. I'm not saying that all the comedy comes from this idea. In fact, let me clarify, I'm not saying that subversions necessarily lend themselves to humour, but simply to the genre of comedy. If not funny, though they often are,
That doesn't make sense. Why would someone who gets paid to do things be at Green Day?
they are at least engaging. Community does this kind of thing constantly, not least in Contemporary American Poetry, Abed's Uncontrollable Christmas, Epidemiology, Basic Rocket Science, Digital Planning Estate, Basic Lupine Neurology, Pillows and Blankets, Documentary Filming Redux, Geothermal Escapism, App Development Condiments, and all of the Paintball episodes. And these are just the episodes that heavily lean into the concepts. These kind of subversions happen all the time, although not too much. Balance is key here in other episodes. For example, horror fiction in 7 Spooky Steps. Speaking of horror games. You might be wondering why I haven't talked about horror films in this video so far. And the answer is, I don't really know. I like horror films. I just watched Longlegs the other day and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was super good, super creepy, a little bit unsettling. But I feel like the amount of content on them is kind of oversaturated on YouTube. And also, I find the mechanics and development behind horror games a lot more interesting. And for the concept of this video, I love that the player is involved in those internal subversions I've been talking about. An internal subversion in a horror game is essentially the game establishing a mechanic which gives you a certain expectation and then subverting that expectation later on to scare you. Simple as that. And this happens all the time. So while I only chose 2 examples, feel free to comment the hundreds more. There definitely are in these. Anytime a game has shocked you like that, giving you a little, oh, this is not how it's supposed to work, I should be safe, you know? That sort of thing. Silent Hill 4 is a game I already talked about fairly extensively in my last video, so go watch that if you haven't already. Please. It is a long game with many minor subversions, but some of you are already aware there's a very glaring one, the titular room. In the beginning, it's a safe room which restores your health, acts as a break from the danger, and even gives you a window to the outside world. But by the end, it's anything but safe. Monsters climb from the walls, the windows shake and rattle, your health remains low, it's straight up haunted. The expectations that the game established are subverted in succession towards the middle and end of the game, and can often leave the player shaken if not terrified every time they happen. This is genius, but I've already talked about it enough. What I want to talk about is another game, one which I could not escape while looking through my comments in the last video. I'm currently a few hours into Amnesia: The Bunker, so I want as few spoilers as possible. Once I finish, I'm very tempted to make a full video on my thoughts, but for now I want to talk about something which was pointed out to me after my last video. The concept of the game is that you're trapped in a French bunker system during World War I, alone except for one deadly creature which can hear almost anything and tunnel through walls like a giant fleshy mole. The only place you're safe is this administration room where you can save your progress. At first you're unsure because the game never actually tells you it's safe itself, but soon you become accustomed to it as a complete safe zone. And then, at some point, you can return to your oh-so-safe room and find one of the monster's tunnels and the area completely trashed. From then on, every time the room shakes or you hear the monster prowling around outside those locked doors, you can't help but wonder whether you are actually safe. In fact, at first, you might well assume that you're not. Just to be clear, the game never explicitly told you it was a safe room, which is a key part of setting up internal expectations. If you lie to the audience, then that's not good horror, despite what my clickbait thumbnail says.
Liar!
It's deceit. Everything that happens must make sense, so when you see the state of your safe room, you aren't annoyed at the game for lying to you, you find yourself rethinking everything and realizing it never actually said you were safe. And that rule applies for all internal subversions. Just as the room repeatedly naturally serves as a safe space throughout the game, internal expectations must be constantly reiterated without giving you anything that doesn't make sense. Just like when you see Jeff taking a game of paintball completely seriously and realize it actually makes sense when the reward for winning is a chance to have a 6-day weekend.
What is this prize?
You don't know.
Priority registration.
Priority registration. That's why everyone's running around like a bunch. Does that mean what I think it means?
And his affinity for cutting corners has been readily established. Seeing that the monster has violated your safe space doesn't make you think, that doesn't make sense, but has you think back and realize that it actually does. Side note, I spent absolutely ages trying to capture a clip of me encountering this event in Amnesia, but it didn't work out, so here's sped up footage of me playing for about half an hour. More than any other genre, horror and comedy want to induce shock, whether that shock leads to laughter or to fear. They want to reduce you from a high ideal to a low real. You could argue that other genres do this to a degree, but it's nowhere near as fundamental as it is with comedy and horror. And this is why subverting expectations is such an important part of both genres. Horror and comedy are attractive to us because they help us see our own lives with a different perspective. Comedy is an escape because we get a peek into this utopian world where anything can happen with little to no repercussions, where ridiculous, awkward or life-altering situations don't have any ridiculous, awkward or life-altering consequences. And horror is an escape because we get a peek into this dystopian world where any number of horrible things can and do happen to people who are just like us. And then we can step back and say, well, at least that's not me. Both rely on our expectations of our own lives at the base level, and then of other media, and then of other media within the genre, and then within the project itself. Out of those, the expectations within the project are the ones that the writers or the developers or the directors have real control over. And just like the examples I talked about, they must be introduced naturally, unintrusively, and over enough time to become subconscious in our minds. And side note, this is why film is a much more difficult medium to accomplish this with. There's just not enough time. Although I've talked about subversions a lot, the expectations are an equally important part of the process. Like with safety and danger, they are two sides of the same coin. So if we were to create some kind of to-do list for subverting expectations in comedy and horror, it would look a little something like this. External subversions. Establish a theme which the majority of the viewership are aware of, and then twist and subvert until it transforms from the expected to the unexpected, whether that be comedically or horrifically. And internal subversions. Establish an expectation, whether that be of a character in a show or a monster in a game, and then continually, subtly, implicitly reiterate the expectation right up until the moment that you subvert it. Hopefully leaving the viewer surprised, or shocked, or disorientated, whether that be in a comedic way or in a horrific way. I hope that all makes sense, and I hope you've enjoyed watching this video. If you have, feel free to subscribe. Thank you so much for all the support on the last video. It currently sits on like 170,000 views, which is mental. So thank you so much. I know there's audio problems. A lot of people were complaining that there's too loud bits and too quiet bits. Hopefully it's better on this video, but comments please, because I'm recording this with default Apple headphones in my phone, so there's no production value going on here. This is just, I didn't clean the background, my bad. Seriously though, it means the absolute world to me. So thank you everyone. My shape-shifting closet demon has just informed me that I forgot to tell you something. I was meant to talk about the top level of my unexpected pyramid, wasn't I? Maybe I'll leave you to figure that out. Bye.